The most dangerous men are rarely surrounded by noise. Watch a room when everyone is trying to matter. Voices rise, opinions overlap. People lean forward as if urgency itself could create value. And then, there is one man who does almost nothing at all. He does not fight for attention. He does not rush to explain himself. He does not decorate his thoughts to make them easier for others to accept. At first, this makes people uneasy. They mistake his distance for weakness. They call it arrogance. Sometimes, they call it damage. But something else is happening beneath the surface. Most people never notice the moment this shift begins. The man who becomes comfortable alone stops leaking need, and the moment need disappears, perception changes. Picture a dinner table. Several men are talking over each other, each one trying to prove he is informed. Connected, important. One man listens with stillness. He speaks only when the noise burns itself out. His words are brief, clean, almost cold. The room reacts differently to him, not because he is louder, because he is harder to move. And this is where the pattern becomes uncomfortable. The crowd does not fear the man who wants to belong. It fears the man who can leave. Because a man who is at ease in solitude cannot be controlled by the usual pressures. Approval loses weight. Rejection loses its sting. Social games begin to look small. Machiavelli understood something most people learn too late. Dependence is always visible, even when hidden behind charm, even when disguised as kindness. The man who needs constant company needs witnesses for his value. But the man who stands alone develops a different presence, less performative, less available, far more dangerous. The truth is not that dangerous men hate people. It is darker than that. They stop building their identity around the crowd. And once a man no longer needs the crowd to confirm who he is, he begins to see human behavior with brutal clarity. That is why solitude changes him. Not because isolation makes him stronger overnight, but because in silence, the masks around him become easier to read. Solitude does something the social world never allows. It removes distraction. And once distraction disappears, a man begins to notice what was controlling him. At first, this is not empowering. It is unsettling. Silence does not feel like freedom. It feels like exposure. Because when there is no audience, no conversation, no movement, a man is left with himself. And many men discover they built their identity on reaction. This is where Jung becomes useful. He understood most people move through life wearing a persona, a social mask. The agreeable professional, the funny friend, the dependable son, the confident man who always has something to say. The mask works because the world rewards it. But the mask also creates a quiet prison. A man surrounded by constant company can keep performing forever. He stays busy, stays visible, stays admired enough to avoid deeper questions. But something strange happens in prolonged solitude. The performance weakens. The mask begins to slip. And what appears underneath is not always pleasant. Buried insecurity, need for validation, fear of insignificance, resentment hidden behind politeness. Most men run back to noise the moment they feel this. They call it boredom, they call it loneliness. But often, it is confrontation. This is why dangerous men prefer to be alone, because they are willing to face what weaker men spend their lives escaping. And once a man sees his own fear clearly, other people lose much of their power over him. Picture a man sitting alone in a dim apartment after midnight. No messages, no music, no one asking who he is. He stares into silence long enough for it to become honest. And in that honesty, he begins separating borrowed desires from real ones. What he wanted for status, what he wanted for applause, what he wanted only because others wanted it first. This is where the power dynamic changes. A man who examines himself in solitude becomes harder to bait, harder to impress, harder to shame, because he is no longer obeying the hunger to be seen. Schopenhauer saw this from another angle. Most men are driven by restless striving, always chasing, always comparing, always moving towards something that loses its magic the moment it is reached. Solitude interrupts that cycle. It shows a man how much of his ambition was never truly his, and that realization is dangerous. Because the man who stops chasing empty rewards becomes unpredictable. He speaks less, chooses more carefully, withdraws from shallow contests. And the crowd never quite knows what to do with a man who cannot be lured by the usual prizes. The crowd rarely understands the man who becomes comfortable alone. At first, they interpret distance as failure. They assume he lost the race. They assume he could not compete, or that he simply stopped trying. But something strange begins to happen over time. While others exhaust themselves chasing recognition, the quiet man starts accumulating something invisible. Clarity. When a man spends enough time outside the noise, he begins to see patterns busy people miss. Who speaks loudly but thinks little, who flatters authority, who panics when approval disappears, who becomes cruel when power shifts. Most people never notice these things. They are too involved in the performance, too busy defending their place in the crowd. But the man who observes more than he performs becomes different. He moves slower, chooses his words carefully, engages only when something actually matters. And this is where Machiavelli's insight becomes visible. People rarely respect the man who tries to be liked. They respect the man who does not depend on their approval. Picture a meeting where tension is rising. Deadlines have slipped. Accusations move around the table. Several men rush to protect themselves. Voices tighten, explanations multiply. One man remains still. He does not rush to defend himself. He waits. He listens. And when he finally speaks, his words land with unusual weight. Not because he is louder, because he has not been spending his energy proving himself every 5 minutes. The crowd senses something difficult to explain. This man cannot easily be manipulated. He does not panic when pressure rises. He does not beg for agreement. He does not rush to rescue his reputation, and that calmness creates a different kind of authority. This is why dangerous men often prefer solitude, not because they hate people, but because solitude removes the constant pressure to perform. In that quiet space, a man becomes independent from the crowd's approval, and independence changes how the world interacts with him. People test him at first. They provoke him. They question him. They try to pull him back into the old rhythm of reactions and explanations. But if he remains steady, something shifts. The same people who once dismissed his silence begin watching him more carefully. Because unpredictability creates tension, and tension creates attention. And that is why the most dangerous men are often the ones who spend the most time alone. If this video made you see people differently, subscribe and continue decoding human behavior on the source code.